Good afternoon. My name is Lykke Friis, chair of the European Council of Foreign Relations, co-chair that is, and I'm also head of the think tank Europa here in Copenhagen. They are talking about a revolution. It sounds like a whisper. Well, that may be true in the case of Tracy Chapman, but not Donald Trump. He has triggered a noisy revolution, not only in the US, but also in Europe. That is one of the core conclusions of the report that we now present to you, a report that was conducted, or various polling was conducted in 12 countries, and is published now, just basically a few hours before the NATO summit kicks off in Hague. But we are not just presenting a new poll to you, we're also presenting a brand new paper that just hot out the printer, Preventing the Next War, a European plan for Ukraine, it's called. And with us, we are happy to have one of the masterminds behind the report, Jana Kobzova, Senior Policy Fellow here at ECFR. So let's get started. Remember, you can always use the Q&A button, and I'll try to get sort of as many of your questions sort of in at the end of the session. And I should also remind you that we are recording this webinar. So Mark, co-founder of ECFR, director of ECFR, you've been crunching the various numbers here. What are the core conclusions that we should all be aware of? Over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Lykke. I'm going to share some slides with you, which represent some of the main findings of the report that Ivan Krastev and I have just written, and I'll show you some of the slides, talk you through a bit of the top line data, and Ivan will then go into a deeper analysis about what it actually means. As you said, our kind of starting point is to look at how Trump's revolutionary presidency is turning European politics on its head. The whole point about the Donald Trump, his second coming, is that he's not just coming back as a normal president, but a lot of his supporters talk about how he's launched a second American revolution. And what's interesting about this revolution is how quickly it's come to Europe. Like all revolutions, it's not just about changing policies and institutions, but ultimately it's about changing the identity of the country. And in Europe, what we're seeing is a kind of profound change, both to the identity of different political forces in Europe, but even to the whole identity of the European project and its geopolitical understanding. And those are sort of main findings of this poll, which we conducted in May 2025 in 12 European countries, over 16,000 respondents. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these two areas. Firstly, how Donald Trump and his political revolution have changed European domestic politics, and then obviously look at the question of geopolitics, which is particularly salient on the eve of the NATO summit. So the political identity is very interesting. Once Trump was elected, we did an opinion poll which showed that most people around the world thought that Donald Trump was good for the US, good for world peace, and good for their countries. But the one exception to that was America's closest allies, particularly in places like South Korea and Europe. And what we've seen now, a few months into the presidency, is that the European resistance to Donald Trump is still very much alive and well, and in some places is growing. So this is a question where people are asked whether Trump's election was good for American citizens, for peace in the world, or for their own country. And you can see a lot of red on the chart. Most people in most countries think that Donald Trump was bad for all three of these things, but there are some quite big differences between particularly Eastern European countries, Hungary, Estonia, Romania, Poland, where you have substantial minorities that think that Trump is maybe good for American citizens, and some even think that he's good for their own country. But by and large, what you see is quite a lot of resistance to Trump. But what's very interesting, if you go below the level of countries, and also on this chart, you can see that the people who are the most hostile to Trump tend to come from the countries that were the most Atlanticist beforehand, countries like Denmark, Germany, the UK. But what's even more interesting is if you go below the level of countries and you look at what's happening to parties. And in 2003, when we had the big, with the Iraq War, when there was a big division between new and old Europe, Europe was split between pro and anti-American countries. But the big difference now is that it's become much more ideological, and what you're having is political parties that are pro and anti-American. And typically, what we're seeing is a big change in the way that particularly populist parties are thinking about themselves. Before, for the last few years, they've largely been parties like, for example, the AfD in Germany, or Vox in Spain, or Confederazio in Poland, or the Fratelli d'Italia in Italy. And typically, these parties were often anti-system parties. They were arguing that the system was broken. But what we're seeing now is that Donald Trump's election has meant that these parties aren't just against things. They also now have a political model which they believe in, and they tend to be pro-American. And on the other hand, a lot of the mainstream parties that used to be quite Atlanticist in their outlook are very anti-Trump and are becoming kind of anti-American, and are therefore more positive about Europe. And you can see there's a kind of reverse correlation between people thinking that the US system works, who are by and large people who support Trump and admire Trump, and those who think that the European Union and the EU political system works, who are often kind of against Trump. What you're seeing, therefore, is a kind of degree of political cross-dressing, where the kind of populist parties on the right are sort of reinventing themselves as being part of this transnational revolutionary movement, and are becoming kind of pro-Trump. And in that way, they both have the advantage of people being able to imagine them coming to power, as we saw after Brexit, but also the disadvantage that they are being often associated with things which are coming out of the White House. And on the other hand, you have the mainstream parties that are increasingly anti-Trump, anti-American, and becoming new defenders of European sovereignty, and even national sovereignty against American interference. The second kind of thing which comes out very strongly from the poll is the way that Europe's geopolitical identity has been changing under Trump. And the most dramatic thing that's happened is that right across Europe, we're seeing that the era of people believing that we lived in peace and security and prosperity is over. Ivan Krastev likes to talk about how Europe used to its core identity was captured by Tony Judd in his phrase post-war. And what the poll shows is that this kind of post-war era is now over, because Europeans in very large numbers are very worried about a whole series of cataclysmic threats to their security, ranging from the EU falling apart, NATO falling apart, their own countries being attacked by Russia, the use of nuclear weapons, major European war, or Third World War. And what you can see is that though not all countries are necessarily worried about Russia attacking them, that tends to be something which is most prevalent in countries in Eastern Europe. Right across the board, people are worried about some of these different threats, particularly the kind of more ominous ones, like nuclear escalation or Third World War happening. And that is leading Europeans to change their policy preferences. So we're seeing very large amount of support across the European Union, with Italy being a notable exception in favor of increasing national defense spending, which is obviously very relevant for the NATO summit at the moment. You see a surprising number of people in different countries who are in favor of reintroducing mandatory military service, conscription. And most dramatically, you're even seeing a large number of people in favor of developing an alternative national nuclear deterrent that does not rely on the US. And this chart shows that there are some countries where there's a majority saying that, but I find it incredible that in a country like Germany, where I'm sitting at the moment, 4 out of 10 people think that Germany should develop a national nuclear deterrent that doesn't rely on the United States. At the same time, there are limits to this move from Venus to Mars, and a kind of realism about what's happening. And there are various different indicators of it. One indicator is that a lot of the people who are actually of fighting age, who might be drawn into conscription, are very much against it. So the people, by and large, who believe in reintroducing conscription are not the ones who would have to fight. Secondly, there's some very interesting data looking at what European countries should do if the US stops arming Ukraine and lifts economic sanctions on Russia and pushes Ukraine to give up occupied territories to Russia. And what you find is that right across Europe, with Hungary being the one exception on military support, countries don't want to follow the United States and think that the EU should maintain its support for Ukraine and not end military support, not lift sanctions, and certainly not push Ukraine to give up occupied territories to Russia. So you see this interesting kind of move towards strategic autonomy, but at the same time, there is a lack of belief that the EU is going to be able to compete economically with the US and China to become independent from the US for its own security and defense policy, and even overcome its own internal divisions. And that is leading us to think that maybe the explanation on Ukraine is that people see a Ukrainian defeat by Russia as something which is an existential threat to Europeans. And maybe their support for Ukraine isn't only about solidarity for an attacked nation, but is also because if the US is pulling out, they want to be able to rely on somebody else to carry on fighting Russia. Maybe the most striking thing, and I'll end with that, is this slide, which shows that although people have got quite realistic perceptions of Donald Trump and what he means for Europe, most people across Europe in many of the different countries polled think that if Donald Trump leaves, the transatlantic relationship can get better again. And our hypothesis, if you take all these things together, is this sense that people, on the one hand, understand that we need to move towards greater strategic autonomy and to rearm and to take more responsibility for our own security. But at the same time, they fear that Europeans can't do it fast enough, and that it's not their faith in the US which is leading to this thing, but the lack of faith in themselves. And this is leading to a kind of sense that Europeans need to buy time and not overreact to what's happening at the moment. So that's the kind of headline data. There's lots more in our report, Trump's European Revolution, which is now available on our website at ecfr.eu. And Ivan will delve into some of the deeper messages that lie behind the headline data.
Thank you very much. I can spend some time to try to figure out, are they in the political cemetery, more people being buried because they didn't read opinion polls or because they were reading them too carefully? For the moment, it's an open question. But still, going to the data, and I'm really strongly recommending for people to read the report. There is a lot of interesting things that should be looked at. There's three things that for me are critically important. And one is, Chairman Mao used to say that who are your friends and who are your enemies is the most important question for every revolution. And from this point of view, we have heard from some important people in the Trump administration that see the far right as the friends, and the liberal establishment in Europe as the enemies. But what this polling is showing very strongly is that the voters of the far-right parties also are seeing the United States as Trump's America, as allies. And listen, on one level, this is not something to surprise us, but on the other side, this is something that should not have been taken for granted before looking at the results. And it, of course, very much varied from country to country. But you're seeing, and Mark was very clear making this point, these parties are not protest parties anymore. They're also not the traditional sovereignists who are simply defending their nation state from the European federalism. They're parties who are much more seeing part of a transnational conservative revolution to which they belong, which means that the relations between the United States and the EU are going to be much more ideological than we have been expecting. This is one thing to have a problem with between the United States and EU based on different geography, different kind of a geopolitical interest and others, and it's totally different to see this through this ideological lenses. And this is important because at the same time, there is some important differences between Trumpian type of nationalism and the nationalism of most of the European far-right parties, which in a long term, in my view, interesting to follow. Listen, if you imagine the offices of the leaders of European nationalist parties, you're going to see a lot of maps in their offices. Some of them maps that their neighbors are not going to like, but in general, they're very much rooted in history. They go very deeply in the history of their nation state. They're very much talking about this in a certain way. They were speaking about history with a capital H. If you go to Trump office, I do believe we're going to find mostly family photos. So this is very much a kind of a nationalism which is deprived of a bigger reading of American history. When Trump is talking about his predecessors, he's doing this mostly to show that he's better than them. And I'm saying this because this kind of a difference in understanding of history is something that we should keep in mind. But on the other side, most of these parties understand that by the United States being on their side, their possibility to get into power, their possibility to make coalitions in their own countries, their possibility to play a major role in European politics is much higher. And also one important thing that Mark has touched on. There is not East-West divide in the sense that basically East is much more pro-American than the West. But there is also one very clear trend. Trumpian right is much stronger in the East than in the West, so you're going to end up with a much more Trump-allied governments in the East than in the West. So the return of the East-West divide is, in my view, something that we are going to see quite strong. And also we can see basically the Trumpian effect working in a very different directions. In the Western Europe, where basically association with Trump is going to create a problem for some of these parties to increase their support. And on the other side, basically in Eastern Europe, where association with Trump can help them to be mainstream and to get much more support. Also, this was interesting because, of course, Trumpian revolution is changing the identity of the liberal mainstream too. And everybody was very much kind of amazed by the Mark Carney effect, where basically Canadian liberals were doomed to lose big, and they basically won. And there was only one major explanation for this, or there were two. There was one legislation which they killed, but also the most important, of course, was Trump. And the story is to what extent this kind of a Carney effect can be seen in Europe. And from this point of view, Denmark is a great example. You can have a Carney effect of a mass mobilization on anti-Trumpian agenda only if Donald Trump is attacking your country directly. If he goes for Greenland, the moment basically you start to attack your country, this mobilization around the flag is very strong, and people who know how pro-Atlantic Danish public opinion is traditionally is going to be shocked, as if they basically had a heart surgery performed and their pro-Atlantic heart was replaced by a different one. This is not the same when Trump is attacking Europe or the European Union. Some people like it, some people dislike it, but you cannot expect the same mobilization effect. So from this point of view, to what extent you can mobilize on anti-Trump sentiment very much depends what are the concrete bilateral relations and how Trump is treating your own nation state, and not simply how he speaks to Europe. At least this is one of the things that is coming out of our survey. And then I'm going to make my last point. And my last point is the problem of timing. And to a certain extent, the question is, are Europeans naive, believing that regardless of all this major ideological divide, they trust that American troops are going to stay in Europe, that basically we can make a trade deal, and that if Trump is not there, the relations are going to be easily normalized? Or Europeans are much more wise than naive, and they understand that to a certain extent, European sovereignty and their kind of a suspicion towards a much more sovereign course of the EU is based not so much in illusions about the United States, but very much based on mistrust in the capacity of the European Union on a short term being able to basically create a certain type of defense capabilities, but even type of economic competitiveness that Europe needs. This is important, in my view. One more important factor for Europeans to be slightly more relaxed on Trump than you can expect comparing with the first type of a survey when you go with the questions about the future of the relationship is the Brexit effect. They remember how dramatic all this was with Brexit, how basically it was now or never. And then Brexit left, and Brexit didn't work particularly well. I'm saying this very mildly in order not to hurt Mark. And then suddenly, basically, you have this kind of a certain normalization of the relationship and type of reapproachment that we're seeing, particularly in the context of Ukraine. So from this point of view, majority of Europeans are not taking the break with the United States as a final saying on the future of the relationship. I'm going to end up here because I was recently read somebody who said that Europe should rearm at the speed of fear. But the problem in Europe is that we don't know how fast the speed of fear is, because this is a very different speed in different EU member states. Over.
Thanks a lot. I can confirm that there is a high speed of fear in my own country, exactly due to Greenland. That is an example of how really Trump, but also his various statements, can change a country. Now we're very much staunch supporters of the European Union, no longer the United States of America, and the willingness to pay for defense is absolutely incredible. And I think one should also mention that solidarity plays also a role here. When one sees that the various sort of European member states are supporting Denmark with regards to Greenland, that also, I mean, leads to an increased support of Danes towards EU. And here, obviously, I'm referring to the recent visit by President Macron to Greenland. Enough of me and about Greenland. Mark, the NATO summit, which is about to take place, in what ways would you imagine that what we are seeing in the poll will play a role during the negotiations? Some of the sort of results that we see in the postcards to Spain, for instance, but many other sort of also splits, you can argue, that you have between member states. But over to you.
Well, there are lots of things I'm sure that Jana and Ivana want to say on it, but I think what the polling shows is, first of all, that people do feel a real deep sense of insecurity, which didn't start with Donald Trump, but has exacerbated and accelerated since he returned to the presidency. And I think the combination of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine with Donald Trump's emergence has led people to kind of believe that we're in a new era. It is striking how, you know, some member states are very worried about Russian invasion. Other member states or states are more worried about World War III and an escalation. And that, in a way, is part of the background to the NATO summit, because Donald Trump doesn't seem to see Russia as a security threat to the US. He's much more worried about nuclear weapons and nuclear escalation, and than he is about fully deterring the invasion of Ukraine. And that is something with some echoes in some member states. But it is very striking how, even though you see this deep fear that Europeans aren't going to get their act together quickly enough and that we might not be able to make it in terms of strategic autonomy, people do seem quite committed to maintaining the European stance on Ukraine, and that I think is another kind of important part of how we rethink NATO and see the idea of a European pillar within NATO and look at it as much about how Europeans organize their own security with less US and how they prepare for the US kind of withdrawing, and to thinking about the alliance in the way that we thought about it for most of its history.
Thanks a lot. Remember that you can ask questions using the Q&A box. I'll go to Jana in just a few seconds. Just a small footnote for myself with regard to the NATO summit. I think it's a bit striking that apparently we're agreeing upon 5% of GDP on defense, but we are no longer sort of having a clear argument with regards to Russia. And I think that's going to be probably at a certain stage a bit complicated to explain to citizens that they should pay more. But at the same time, one is not really sort of pushing the case with regards to, the threat that you're actually seeing from Russia. Ivan, when one looks upon Central and Eastern Europe, you just mentioned it briefly, do you see sort of a threat that you would suddenly have the old so-called Visegrad countries sort of turning sort of into MAGA allies, or how do you actually look upon that?
Listen, we have elections in the Czech Republic. And
exactly.
Yeah, we know probably who is going to win, but we don't know how his coalition is going to look like. And of course, you cannot have a real Visegrad 4 in the absence of Poland. And for the moment, for sure, the Polish government is not going into this direction, because this is one of the interesting findings of our survey. When it comes to Trump's America, the mainstream, the liberal parties in Central and Eastern Europe as critical as those in the Western Europe. The real difference between East and West is the strength of the Trumpian right, and this is much stronger in the East. The other thing that comes very strongly is the changing view on the nuclear power. And I mean particularly, in a certain way, Europeans are starting to learn to love the bomb. And there are countries in which people are not simply hoping that American security guarantees when it comes to the nuclear are going to stand. They're not simply hoping that Brits and French are going to help us. By the way, even the French far right is ready to help us when it comes to the nuclear deterrence. But you have countries like Poland and others where people are simply dreaming for their national bomb. And this kind of this connection between sovereignty and the atomic bomb is becoming very strong. And I do believe what we're seeing in the Middle East is much more going to strengthen this type of connections than to weaken it. So this is a dramatic change. And particularly even if you look at Germany, you're going to see much more nuclear enthusiasm than normally you expect from the Germans.
There's actually just an opinion poll out today confirming that point. Germans asked about the nuclear umbrella, where they actually support that to a very, very high extent. Jana, now it is over to you. I mean, your brand new paper, as already highlighted, deals with Ukraine. I mean, a plan on basically making sure that we could prevent the next war. So let's hear briefly about the plan, and I'll get back to you about the present study and how that sort of links to Ukraine.
Thank you, Lika. Thank you. I think just a small remark, listening to what Mark and Ivan were saying, the one thing that I was thinking, traditionally for European extremist forces, the Russians were the kind of natural allies. Now they found a new friend in Trumpian America, which is kind of another source of concern, I think, for a number of mainstream political parties across Europe, including here in Central Europe. But I think if there is one place where the Europeans are increasingly realizing that they will need to do much more on their own and without the US, that is indeed Ukraine. Not just because of the geographical proximity, but also over the past 6 months, ever since Trump entered the White House, they made it very clear that they might try something, but ultimately whatever happens in Ukraine will have to be dealt with primarily by the Europeans, who don't happen to be even in the room when it comes to negotiations. And so together with my colleagues, Camille Grand and Nicu Popescu, we tried to look kind of not just at the next battle and where is the next village going to be that the Russians are going to control, or the next round of negotiations, but we tried to take a longer look and look at kind of, okay, what kind of Ukraine will the European Union neighbor in a few years from now, understanding that whatever happens in Ukraine is going to have direct knock-on effects on the Europeans. And so what needs to be done, and how can the European do that to ensure that whatever happens down the line, irrespective of whether the fighting stops this year, which looks increasingly less likely, or the year after, ultimately the Europeans will be bordering some sort of a Ukraine, and it's also up to us to shape how that Ukraine is going to look like. And so we start by basically painting two scenarios. Both of them are kind of probably more realistic than the maximalist objectives. On the Ukrainian side, of course, the ideal scenario is they control all of their territory, they are a member of NATO and the EU. And of course, on the Russian side, the best case scenario is that Ukraine is completely under Moscow's control. Now, in absence of those scenarios, basically both sides look for the kind of next best option. And in 5 years, we can basically have a Ukraine that does not control all of its territory, but whatever is under Kiev's control is more or less stable, economically prosperous. It's slowly recovering. The Ukrainian refugees are coming back, and they're increasingly more integrated, if not politically, with the European Union, than at least practically in terms of connections, businesses, infrastructure, and so on. And of course, in that case, Ukraine would be a key pillar of European stability in the Europe on the EU's border. But there is, of course, another scenario, which is definitely something that Russia will try to do. And the argument basically is that with the end of fighting, of active fighting, Ukraine's struggles will continue, and Moscow will use these struggles to undermine Ukraine from within. As any country that faces post-war conditions, Ukrainians will have to face enormous reconstruction costs, economic costs, the issue of integrating the war refugees, the war veterans. As we are speaking now, Ukraine already has more than 1 million veterans. The estimate is that in 5 or 6 years, this will grow to maybe 5 billion, including their families. So it's a huge population. I mean, Lika, I'm looking at you. Denmark and Slovakia have 5 million population. Just to get the scale, you're 6. Okay, we're still 5. So there are numerous challenges, which, if the Russians do not get their way on the battlefield, they will kind of try to do as much as possible what they've been trying to do even before the full-scale invasion, which is kind of undermine Ukraine from within, through economic means, corruption, hybrid warfare, using their assets within Ukraine, and to kind of use this post-war situation to basically turn Ukraine into a country that is a destabilizing factor on the EU's borders. And so what we're trying to paint for the EU to do right now is that the Europeans have done a lot of good things already, probably more than we were all thinking in the beginning that we would be able to do, both when it comes to guns, providing Ukraine with military support. We are now discussing deploying troops on the ground at one point, and then also money, in terms of weapons and financial support. The European support far exceeds the United States, and there is probably more to come. If for nothing else, is because we need to ensure that the Ukraine is financially and economically sustainable. But ultimately, neither the weapons nor the money alone are going to reconstruct the country or kind of address the broader challenges with integration of people who fled the war, or the war veterans, or small arms connection, or address the domestic security issues, which A, will emerge, and B, Russia will try to use to destabilize Ukraine from within. So our suggestion is that besides the kind of continued military assistance, which will more increasingly look like joint ventures and cooperation with Ukraine's defense industry, and integration with the European Union, which for reasons having to do with internal politics in a number of EU countries, including Hungary, may not move very fast on the political level, but in real life, in terms of business connections, infrastructure connections, economic connections, energy connections, those things can and need to proceed. we also need to start drawing together with the Ukrainians a plan to stabilize the country once the fighting ends. And we lay out in the brief of how to do that, and we argue that that planning needs to start now. If we only wait once the fighting starts, the fighting stops, excuse me, it might be too late. The Ukrainians and the Europeans together might be and need to be ready for that kind of situation to make sure that if we cannot achieve the best possible outcome, we can achieve something that kind of keeps both the Europeans and the Ukrainians stable and prosperous.
Thank you very much. Just before I open for questions, I can see there are a number of questions that I'll try to read, and try to see whether I can also make sure that some of them are grouped together. I'm sure you saw the poll that we're debating. I mean the Mark and the one that Mark and Ivan just went through. What are your sort of conclusions when you read those figures with regards to Ukraine and your plan?
You know, I find it actually quite interesting how much support there still is in Ukraine, which is for Ukraine, given that the war has been going on, I mean, in this intensity for 3.5 years. And I think that it relates to something that Mark was already saying. This is not just an expression of solidarity. This is, I think, really an increased realization that if the US is slowly out of Europe, and we don't know how fast or slowly that's going to happen, that European pillar of NATO or European security cannot be assured without the Ukrainians. They have the most battle-hardened army at the moment. They've been able to hold the Russians. Russians, as we speak, control less territory now than they controlled in April and March 2022. So this is becoming, I think, a reflection, which to me is surprising also at the level of public perception, that this is not some sort of a grand geopolitical strategy. This is an acknowledgement that if the US is out, we kind of need some sort of a support, including in the form of strong Ukraine that is able to stand on its own and help us protect from the threats, including Russia.
Thanks a lot. So I'm not going to see the various questions here. I think there are a few questions that one could group together with regards to the nuclear deterrence, France's role with regards to that, and also how EU political leadership should react to individual countries pursuing a nuclear weapon. So that's sort of part of the discussion about nuclear weapons. Then there was a question here about sort of referring to the end of the report, where you write that the Trump moment offers an opportunity for mainstream parties to reinvent a European identity for revolutionary new world. How can you expand slightly on that? And then there is also a question on immigration, how that actually feeds into the present Europe that we're having at the moment. Who would like to respond to those first chunk of questions? Ivan, let's hear what you have to say.
Listen, I'm going to focus on the last two because I talked something about nuclear, and let's, Mark said. First is about the identity. One of our major arguments is that Trump's coming is changing the identity of everybody. Yesterday, the far right have been the sovereignists, and they were very much betting on the national state, and they're very much fighting Brussels. Suddenly now they're the internationalists. They're going to have their relations with Trump in many respects is going to be like the relations of the West European Communist Party with respect to the Soviet Union. They should defend certain policies. It's interesting to see where they're going to stay on Iran and others. So from this point of view, this is changing the perspective. It could be for good, it could be for bad, but it's a totally different positioning. For the mainstream liberals, which till now have been defending the status quo, because some of the criticism that the basic message coming out of the mainstream parties was just how fearful and awful it's going to be if the others are going to come to power. Now they have a possibility to play a slightly different game. And this is very critical in places like Denmark, where you have a totally new consensus around certain issues. But it is also to understand that, listen, European Union is needed. For none of these countries can have any effective foreign or defense policy on their own, even the big one. And from this point of view, reinventing and re-arguing the European Union on a much more realpolitik language, and very much trying to mobilize some of the classical national sentiment and going for this type of progressive nationalism that we see in places like Canada for the first time is an option, which was not the option before for many of the leaders. Where migration stands, listen, anti-migration is one of the most important things that comes with Trump and the conservative revolution, but also what we see in the United States, in my view, is going to be even stronger than in Europe. It's one thing to believe that the border should be closed and that there is a need to put a lot on social cohesion and integrating people who are already within the countries. Let's put it the Danish version of internationalism. It's totally different to support basically the deportation of all people who are living basically in the country, who has arrived in the country. And even in the United States, if you see the latest polling, you're going to see that politics of deportation is now very much questioned both by some of the businesses, which basically see this as a major threat, but also by the people who said, close the border and integrate those who are in, and not just close the border and try to expel anybody whom you don't like. And in my view, this is going to be a major debate, and for the mainstream parties, both on the center left, center right, also the Greens, there is a major story to reframe the debate. Because one of the biggest story was not to argue against or to adopt the position of the far right, but to change debate itself. And with Trump, we have the possibility of this reframing. By the way, even on foreign policy, Trump and his position on Ukraine suddenly allowed some of the mainstream liberal parties to show that they're the peace party, that this is not just for us to say that we want peace and the Russians are going to arrive on the table to sign it. So there are certain opportunities that exist with Trump, which in my view should be used. And the problem is how intelligently they're going to be used. And also it's going to be different from country to country. And this is why the national elections are going to be so important to define kind of the dynamics of this impact that Trump is going to have on European politics. It's also going to be critically important what is happening in the United States. Does he succeed? That he fails? We are seeing all these major things that are happening around us. And I'm going to leave these questions, particularly the nuclear, to Mark.
Mark?
Hi. I was actually going to suggest that Jana could deal with the nuclear. She's been working a lot more on those.
This is our version of a feminist foreign policy.
But maybe just to add one more thing on how mainstream parties can reinvent themselves and what the data shows. I mean, in a way, what we've seen just between the poll that we did late last year after Trump was elected and now is that Trump has become more unpopular in Europe in a short period of time as he's been in office. And what I think you get from this change of dynamic that Ivan was describing so brilliantly is a kind of sense of incumbency around these populist parties. So they're not footloose and fancy-free, they're defending Trump. And Trump, therefore, both creates a glass ceiling to their support, because, you know, in countries like the UK, only 12% of the population think that Trump is a good thing for the country. So if you're too closely associated with it, then it kind of creates a glass ceiling for your support. But also, in the same way that Brexit actually initially started empowering populist parties and far right, then it created a problem for them. And many of those parties had to rapidly change the way that they position themselves around the EU and say that we're about refounding Europe rather than leaving Europe. We don't want to leave the euro, etc. You're going to see a sort of dynamic emerge there. And, you know, the more we see things like these attacks on Iran and other things like that take us into unknown territory, I think the more nervous a lot of different players will be in different countries. But I think it's also worth remembering what Ivan said earlier, that there is a big difference between the data in Denmark, where the country's been kind of directly attacked, from the data in places that are maybe, you know, not big fans of Trump's trade policy or of his attacks on on European Union generally, but it's not necessarily enough to carry their parties through an election campaign. So I think a lot will depend on what comes out of the US, but potentially it could lead to really quite big new cleavages in European politics. And it could be as tough for a lot of these anti-system parties that seem to be doing very well, but then actually ended up finding Brexit, COVID, some of those other things, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, creating some dilemmas for them about how they position themselves vis-a-vis Putin, vis-a-vis leaving the European Union, and how they, you know, distinguished themselves from political projects that weren't working very well before. You know, I would have thought if we do another poll at the end of this year, we will see, you know, even more effect of Trump in action, where he moves from being a sort of theoretical force that people can project their hopes onto to something which is a bit more scary and a bit more real, and which has a much more polarizing effect on European politics.
So a Donald Trump that's even more scary than one we have. That's kind of prediction for the next poll. Jana, your reflections, and maybe I could also ask you to reflect on Belarus, basically the happy news from the weekend that the opposition leader's husband was freed. Any reflections on that? The EU's role, the US role? Over to you, and you can obviously also pass on that question.
Sure. I will start with nuclear. I mean, there are a couple of questions related to how and what the Europeans should do. And I think Ivan has mentioned rightly that a lot of the Europeans are now also looking at what's happening in the Middle East and Iran. Not to mention the lessons that I think the Ukrainians have learned and bitterly regret that they had given up the nuclear weapons in 1994 and 1991. I think it's too early to say, but I think that, you know, it's in a way it's a chicken and egg problem, because I think a lot of the Europeans, or majority of Europeans, realize that the American security umbrella is not as certain as it was before. Let's put it this way. But there is also a concern among NATO members that the more you start preparing for it, the more you start talking about it, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, you know, I think we're a bit far ahead when it comes to how do we share France's nuclear deterrent, but I think that conversations are starting, which is a fundamental change compared to what it was a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure this is going to go away when the administration in the US changes. That's first. The second, I wouldn't underestimate the shock that the Trumpian politics has caused especially in Central and Eastern Europe. This is a region that has benefited a lot from the US promotion of democracy, both before we entered the European Union and after we entered the European Union. And that kind of support is gone. This alludes to this kind of support for extremist forces. But I also wonder how much the forces that are anti kind of mainstream will want to be aligned with Trump in the long term, because besides his anti-woke agenda, when you look at number of countries and extremist politicians or kind of populist politicians, real world Trump's decisions are causing a lot of problems. You know, whether it's on tariffs. It's hard to find any supporters on this side of the Atlantic for Trump's tariffs. The same for Iran's intervention. You know, so the parties that would normally be aligned on an ideological position with Trump find it really hard to be aligned with him on policies. And it will be interesting to see how that develops over time. I think the question on Belarus, basically, this has been a result of a couple of months long effort by the US. To see and test how far the Belarusians can go. As we all know, Lukashenko has mortgaged Belarusian independence to Russia a long time ago, but he's also interested in not becoming another province of Russia. And he is increasingly interested in kind of seeking new export routes, and different kind of collaboration, and the release of this opposition leader, one of the opposition leader, is a result of that outcome. I think the EU has not been much involved because we have a strict sanctions policy, and there is for now no decision among the 27 member states to change that, even though some member states would like to open up the dialogue. We have had that kind of up and down with the Belarusian regime before, and there is a growing interest to go back to kind of seeking some sort of a dialogue if the Belarusian regime shows its seriousness by releasing more political prisoners.
Thanks a lot. And now that you are on the roll here, I mean, there's another one I think which is very important, and hopefully you can answer it. So the NATO summit just around the corner, we have Trump. How will sort of the relationship that we're seeing now with Donald Trump, how will that sort of feed into the EU's ambition of strengthening its security and defense policy? And as the overall point here is also that's going to be a slightly difficult question mark, since NATO is very much depending upon United States. So how do you build a pillar within NATO if NATO is no longer there? Jana?
Well, I think the realization has been there. The Europeans have started doing things they, in minds of many, should have started doing 3 years ago when Russia attacked Ukraine. But I think we have seen that. I think for a lot of people in Western Europe, the shock only came with Vice President Vance's speech in Munich. But in a way, the preparations for that started with the European Commission having a special commissioner for defense. And the realization really is that we need to invest much more. I think, to me, the question is not if, the question is how we do it in a way that's not disruptive to the whatever security partnership there still is with the United States, and how we do it in a way that's sustainable for our own budgets. And we have seen that discussion also ahead of the NATO summit, when basically Spain has gotten a bit of an opt-out from the 5%. But I think that conversation is finally being kind of transformed into concrete steps. But I would also say that we are still far too slow when it comes to public procurement, when it comes to integration and procurement of defense industries, production, finding creative ways of speeding up the production and so on. And I think this is going to be a really difficult task, especially if we still don't know. And if we hear from the public opinion polls that we are still kind of hedging that things will be okay once Trump is out of office, the question how sustainable and durable this kind of new rearmament drive is still pretty much there.
Great. So the most difficult questions are always the very short ones. So Ivan, this one is for you. Why is Eastern Europe more Trump prone?
For several reasons. In a certain way, there were two issues on which Trump was very strong and which basically echoed in Eastern Europe. Never worked in Eastern Europe. Don't forget that there is a major difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and this is the experience of the 1968. 1968 was also a kind of a very important freedom year for Eastern Europe, but it was about a national freedom. People who have been on the streets of Prague or in Warsaw, this was about national independence, while in Western Europe, it was very much about the freedom of individual. It was very much about sexual revolutions and all other things. So as a result of it, Eastern Europe was much more conservative of many of these cultural issues. And also for Eastern Europe, the process of adapting to this new cultural reality was very tough, and it was very much basically pushed by the process of European integration, where East Europeans has to vote a lot of legislation, to adopt many legislation they have not been voting for. So part of this kind of a new right was coming as a result of anti-woke and anti-migration. And don't forget that during the migration debate, the East-West divide was very clear. So this is where it is. But what is interesting is that while in a previous situation, you have a much broader consensus of siding with the United States, now this goes really on the party line. Look at Hungary. On one level, basically, you have one of the countries that has a very strong support for President Trump. They like him. They like what he is doing. But on the other side, you see it's very much around party lines. The opposition, basically, is very strong anti-Trump in all directions, because for them, it's not about Trump, it's about their own political leader. So from this point of view, yes, East Europeans have been more conservative for many reasons. And by the way, the East European countries are not one country. It also very much varied from country to country. But I do believe that migration work, and to a certain extent, green policies. It's not by accident that the Green Party was not among the strongest party in the East. So this kind of a history explains why some of the Trump ideas resonated more in the East than in the West.
Thank you very much. We just have 5 minutes left. So Mark, I think first of all, a question here from Ivana. The overall question, I was going to say repeating my question, but that would be a bit strange reading that one out. Why? I mean, where do we see the counter-revolutionaries in Europe? I mean, where are they, sort of, with regards to the political parties? Second question from myself, the famous MEGA, Make Europe Great Again. Do you sort of see that happening when you look upon the poll, and particularly do you see it happening down the line, or are you more worried about the very splits that we're seeing also in the poll? So you get the last word here until I
great.
conclude.
So I think on the counter-revolutionaries, you know, it's too early to see really powerful counter-revolutionaries. What I think you've seen is that different countries are trying different things out. It's very interesting to see how Emmanuel Macron has been moving. You know, last time when Trump was elected, he rushed to Washington and tried to become the biggest Trump hugger and to try and shape Trump. And then that didn't work out quite as he hoped in terms of influencing what the US was doing. Now you're seeing him going to Denmark and Greenland and trying to reposition himself and to use it in a different way. I think the Danish approach is quite interesting. I mean, we've seen that public opinion has shifted very, very powerfully there. But you're seeing these different strategies. Keir Starmer has got another approach of trying to work more closely, but he's now got into a bit of a muddle over Iran because obviously Trump is very unpredictable. So the closer you try and hug him, the more likely you are to get crushed or burned as a result of it. But I imagine that once there is a bit more clarity about what the Trump legacy is, there will be greater attempts by many parties to pin the revolution onto the populist forces in their different countries and attempts to kind of run against different elements. When it comes to the whole NATO summit and the idea of making Europe great again and strategic autonomy, you know, I'm actually quite heartened by the opinion poll. I think on the one hand, people do realize that we're in a new place. There is very little doubt that there's a lot of insecurity, that we need to take it very, very seriously. There are some fears that Europeans aren't going to get their act together quickly enough. And there are questions, you know, I think there are real trade-offs. It's not clear to me that we do need to necessarily spend 5% on European defense. I mean, the Soviet Union was a much bigger military and systemic threat to Europe than today's Russia is. There are all sorts of lessons we can learn about spending the huge amount of money that we spend on defense at the moment in a more effective way. There are lots of reforms that need to take place. And you know, what we've seen is a very realistic attitude towards the NATO summit, where the main goal is just to survive and to say whatever you need to do in order to discourage Donald Trump from doing anything kind of too dramatic around it, which is why people have lined up behind a totally fake 5% goal, which very few countries actually think that they're going to meet. You know, I think this is a kind of evolving situation. But hopefully what we're going to do is to have both a strategic goal, which is to start making the big dramatic changes that Jana was talking about earlier in terms of our security positioning, and to kind of take that much more seriously, with some tactical attempts to deal with what comes out of Washington and to manage that as well as possible. And I think that is quite a difficult thing to manage, how you have a sense of where you want to go, strategically, but to have the flexibility to deal with a very kind of volatile political situation where there are a lot of unknown things that are going to come our way, and also a lot of elections in Europe. And I think that's the other thing which has been quite surprising recently. You know, a lot of people thought that Romania was going to go the kind of MAGA way, and then were quite surprised by the election result. But then Poland went the other way, and these are often very, very close run things. Like the Brexit vote, it was quite contingent. The very small number of Polish people had voted the other way. You could have had a very, very different mood in Warsaw at the moment. I think, you know, it's pretty uncertain. So I think it's right for people to try and have a kind of more pragmatic approach of trying to find their way through it. But from our poll, it seems very clear to me that there is a deep sense, which is quite widely shared across Europe, north, south, east, and west, that we are in a different world, and that the European project has to be a war project as well as a peace project. And that is something which is very, very different to where we were a few years ago. And it's particularly interesting seeing how public opinion in countries like Germany has changed. I mean, that is quite a dramatic thing.
Thanks a lot to our speakers and also to our audience. I think one could end with another Tracy Chapman song, Crossroads, because that was very clear that we are at a crossroads, but it's much easier to say we are at a crossroads instead of sort of figuring out what to do. But there's help just around the corner, because the ECFR's annual council meeting taking place in Warsaw will be something you can follow live, because we are live streaming the event, and it starts on Friday at 1:30. One will be able sort of to listen to some of the first sort of really, really important sort of debates that we'll have there. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us, and you can see the various links to the report. So there's no excuse for not sort of making sure that you actually read that report before we get to the NATO summit. Thank you very much. From Copenhagen, tak, ha det godt.